The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. According to On Track, the magazine published by the CDA, or Conference of Defense Associations Institute, hybrid warfare, also known as gray zone conflict or unrestricted warfare, is a real and present danger. On Track states these are just three terms used to describe the same phenomenon. Multifaceted attacks against a country that have serious implication for its national security and defense institutions. They may include military elements, but may also be mounted using cyber tools, public and commercial corruption, weaponization of legal systems, transnational organized crime, and disinformation campaigns, along with a host of other methods. Effective responses will demand an unprecedented level of cooperation between military, intelligence, cyber, and other security experts in partnership with experts in the management of conflict in business, legal, and public settings. Critical risk expert Calvin Chrustie points out FBI Director Christopher Wray statement saying the Chinese government is a serious threat to Western business. The Chinese government sees cyber as the pathway to cheat and steal. In addition to traditional and cyber-enabled thievery, there are even more insidious tactics they use to essentially walk through your front door and rob you by making investments and creating partnerships that position their proxies. They use elaborate shell games to disguise these efforts from foreign companies, including shutting off data that used to enable effective due diligence. A 2017 law allowed them to force Chinese employees in China to assist in Chinese intelligence operations. I invited Calvin Chrustie, a critical risk consultant with a depth of experience in anti-terrorism and complex international investigations and intelligence operations, to join me for a conversation that matters about the nefarious activities of countries that do not have Canada's best interests at heart. Calvin, welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, are you? Is it as bad as I spelled out in that intro?
I think it is, and I think, we've been having these conversations. I think you and I first had a conversation several years ago about some of these activities, and we have conversations with our clients, with the government sector, and I think particularly in the last several weeks, when one looks at the newspaper headings across the country and globally as well, it's pretty hard to escape the conversation. It's a difficult concept to grasp and understand because of the complexity, but it's also a difficult one, I think, because it does create a high degree of anxiety and concern without a clear path for solutions and mitigation, to be quite frank.
Well, as spelled out in that introduction, it seems to be coming at us on all fronts. It's not just a military assault, it's not just a political assault, but it creeps into every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, and I think there's a famous book written by Mark Galeatti, who's one of the leaders in terms of thought leaders in there, who wrote about this phenomena with the state of Russia. And his book's titled Weaponization of Everything. And it basically is that. And one of the challenges I think we have is experts plus government always like to compartmentalize issues or problems in terms of, in this particular case, for example, very, very prominent to people currently here in Vancouver, looking at it, money laundering, or in Ottawa, electoral interference. But to look in them in isolation, I don't think does a disservice to the whole threat mitigation and protection of Canadians from this threat. The interconnectivity of all the threats is really important, as you alluded to, and to try to look at them as individual threat vectors, I think undermines our response and our understanding, as Canadians, to have an awareness in terms of, the seriousness of the threat and the complexity of it.
So, who has to take the lead here? Because if there's so many different institutions and politicians, and then there are the laws, there's the court, and then individuals, like, how do we move in a way that says, okay, we're going to protect the things that are important to our national identity?
Well, I think the phenomena isn't restricted. I mean, like, from a government perspective, it's not restrictive to the federal government. It's not restricted to the provincial government, and it's not restricted to municipal or even indigenous communities. I think that's really important. But most importantly, 75%, I'd say roughly, as that article that we wrote about, of the threat activities hit business leaders, law firms, public servants, and that. So the public themselves has to take a leadership role on it. I was watching a video, I think last week, I think it was a Johnny Carson, old clip from Johnny Carson, and it had Ronald Reagan on it. And his message was, the most important message to Americans when he was in leadership was, don't rely on government to get you out of problems. It's going to be the public. They have the innovation. They've got the capital. They've got the intellect. They have all the capability to do this. And, you know, from a democratic perspective, theoretically, they're empowered to lead as well. And I think, at least in my experience, the concerning part is Canadians currently, and I'm sure other countries as well, are relying on the government to protect them and mitigate them. But I would say that they would have I would urge them to use caution in terms of relying on the government to do it. The bureaucracy, the complexity of the issues, the legal framework that we have in Canada really makes it difficult for the public sector to protect the private sector and the Canadians generally.
I got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So in that introduction, I pointed out that a 2017 law in China compels Chinese citizens to share anything that they have to do with, intelligence with the Chinese government. Do we have a law like that here in Canada? Are we morally obliged as individuals, if we come across something, to report it? And if we do, are we protected?
I think, it's probably one of the biggest impediments, I would say, is our legal framework in terms of protecting Canadians. I think it's really hard, even for the well-intended Canadians that want to do the right thing, because of the structures of the laws that we have in Canada. I've talked about this, in other public inquiries I've been involved, i.e. the Cullen Commission on money laundering, that it makes it really hard to work at a global level with our international allies and our partners. But it even makes it hard for the public to work with the police, work with our intelligence community, because of the laws in terms of, under the charter of Stinchcombe, is basically, if you have a conversation with the police person and they're looking at prosecution, they're going to have to disclose that information. And the
source.
And the source of it. So it's very difficult to protect. The only protection I'm aware of is then protected through becoming a human source. And how many CEOs or how many CFOs or how many lawyers want to be an informant for the police? Not that many, I would imagine. So it's one of the only areas that you can get protection. So a lot of what happens quite often is, I think the issues get buried in boardrooms, law offices, because they're trying to mitigate the reputational risk attached to coming forward and cooperating with it. And we saw that with BCLC in the money laundering issues here regionally, where they came forward with an issue that they had with well intentions, and then the next thing that happened was the inquiry and all the collateral damage. There was no protection to them, even though they were trying to do the right thing. And then all of a sudden everything gets spun out in terms of the media, in terms of social media. Who knows who was on social media, escalating, amplifying these things, and it's kind of it's very difficult to deal with these type of issues, come forward, and expect any type of confidentiality in it.
So, you talk about the fact that, yes, there may be military installations that are being targeted and so on, but you then say, no, there's a much broader and more insidious campaign underway that is targeting the civil liberties that we have, or the using and guiding social media networks and non-governmental agencies to push forward messages, and they're doing it on so many fronts. How do any of us know whether or not what's moving us in one direction is legitimate?
I think that's the one of the biggest concerns is you don't know. I mean, and that's one of the strategic objectives, from the adversaries, is to create that uncertainty in terms of truth, non-truth, in terms of, say, business leaders or political leaders having the ability to develop a strategy, have strategic objectives. Well, when all the information is so murky and there's conflicting information and fake news and misinformation and disinformation and malign information, it basically makes it very difficult to operate and be strategic as business leaders, legal leaders, political leaders in this type of environment, because at the end of the day, the community is confused in terms of what's happening and what to believe, what not to believe, and it really makes us more vulnerable for additional threats. And that's kind of the strategic approach of our adversaries, is to create confusion, create chaos, and create vulnerabilities that they can exploit further.
You also talk about the weaponization of organized crime.
Yeah.
How terrifying is that?
Well, I think we're seeing, we're seeing a lot of, say, just easy issues, very identifiable. Photographs of our politicians at all levels with organized crime and organized crime affiliates. It really doesn't matter at that point whether our politicians are engaged in organized crime, receiving illicit finance, in terms of their donors and their sponsors. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But at the end of the day, the intent is not that. The intent is to undermine the trust in terms of the leadership in democracy, and undermine democracy and the principles of democracy to create those vulnerabilities. So we are seeing that alignment in terms of it. The question that I always had was the generation of billions and billions of dollars through illicit finance here, in terms of, say, for example, in the Canadian context, how much of this is going to sponsor, well, we saw in the Cullen Commission, it was going to government, to support government in terms of policing, healthcare, education, in terms of some of that through the casino process. So how much of that in other sectors is going to sponsor, foreign investment in terms of critical infrastructure, in terms of natural resources, and that, I don't know how much is, but I would imagine that there would be a significant amount of money being moved and being manipulated in terms of seizing the interest in critical infrastructure and natural resources as well.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Okay, you're scaring the daylights out of me. What do we do about this? Is there a way that we can move forward?
I think number one is having conversations about it, obviously, and heightening awareness. NATO's primary approach to it is awareness is probably the greatest mitigating factor to it. So putting the spotlight on it, they hope to mitigate it. So in Europe, say, for example, they have probably more dialogue than we are, say, for example, in North America having on it historically. I mean, we're obviously having some in the last 1 to 2 years, but it's been going on probably for 20 to 30 years.
So how are we supposed to have that dialogue, though, when our prime minister, the moment you raise it, especially if you mention the Chinese government, he goes, that's racist. Well, no, we're talking about the Chinese government. We're not talking about Chinese people. We're talking about the government. But
Yeah.
he wants to shut down that conversation right from the start. So how do we have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the biggest challenges, and I think you hit a super important issue. Anybody that knows this issue knows that it's about states, and it's not about cultures, and it's not about people. It's about, governments and their infrastructure in terms of their military infrastructure, intelligence infrastructure, and security apparatus. It's very difficult to have that conversation when it gets shut down like that, but I guess persistence will happen. I think the journalism field probably has played and is playing probably the most critical field at this particular time, but unfortunately they are getting attacked as well. And I just think the more, just the persistence in terms of keep having these dialogues. And sometimes things have to break, and sometimes the situation has to get better, sometimes, unfortunately, for a system to evolve and get better. And I think that's kind of the state where we're at right now. In terms of the public confidence, in terms of our political apparatus, I'd say is probably getting close to an all-time low right now, which hopefully will lead to some opportunities in terms of improving things.
So in that statement from FBI Director Christopher Ryan,
Yes.
He says they'll walk right through your front door. They invest in your company. They place their proxies on your board. What then becomes the responsibility of a public company to move forward, to step forward, and how can they do so?
Well, I think one of the challenges is, I think our culture isn't known to be the most strategic thinking culture like other cultures. And I think there is a high degree of indifference in terms of how this is going to impact them today versus how it's going to impact them tomorrow and future generations. And I think that's the concerning part, is we have to be possibly looking at a more strategic approach to this in terms of business leaders and others recognizing, well, this may not impact them today. It's going to impact their kids tomorrow, and it's going to impact their future generations on it. Other generations, i.e. our grandfathers who fought in World War II, they weren't thinking about just themselves, they were thinking about future generations. And I think that's something we have to bring to. And I think that's why in the Project CSHAT, which you alluded to, that I'm a participant in, that's why we took the approach that we took. We looked at this and we went to change. There's a lot of people trying to spotlight and change the issues today, and what we did is strategically we looked at some lessons learned from the adversaries in terms of a strategic play, i.e. playing chess rather than playing checkers, and going, hey, let's work with the university environment. So we're working with business schools, law schools, international affairs schools, and try to build up, number one, the awareness, number two, is the skills, number three is to provide some awareness and access to tools. And that's why we're working with the universities, and that's why we, developed this project, CSHAT, for that purpose.
Well, isn't the Chinese government working with those same universities?
It does appear, at least the Chinese government is, and perhaps others.
Suggesting more?
I would suggest that I don't think we've really looked at that issue. I know, the issue of Chinese government involvement in the Canadian universities has been spotlighted recently in the paper with some evidence to support it. And I would guess that there would probably be, our adversaries would probably be in there, other adversaries, would be there as well, possibly the Iranian government and others.
Okay, so it comes down to individuals as well. What can an individual do? Because, you're looking at the resources of countries, not just companies, but countries. Mm-hmm. And you're an individual as a Canadian citizen. First of all, do I have a legal responsibility to report a crime if I witness it?
Well, context is everything. So it'd be hard to go, hey, in this particular situation or not. Morally, ethically, and professionally, you would, 100% legally. It's always a gray area, and it's kind of case specific. All I'll say is the approach that we're taking on it, and I go back to one of your original questions in terms of like how to deal with it, and the information warfare I'll refer to in terms of the misinformation, disinformation, malign information, where it becomes really confusing what's going on, what's that, and I think that awareness piece and the understanding as to really what's happening is essential. And I'll go back to that, is if you look at Finland, in elementary school, junior high school, they teach their kids the difference between news and fake news. They're educating their generations how to mitigate this threat. And unless we kind of look at it, from a very strategic approach like this, the back and forth bantering, between one political leader to the other political leader using it for political mileage, I don't think is going to get us that far. And I think that's why, the educational factor is probably going to be the most impactful in this approach. How to go forward in terms of if you do have that information. It's something that we face. We get clients all the time in our own business coming forward and saying, hey, we have this information, we want to do the right thing. And it is a really complex process in terms of how to get sensitive information from a person in Canadian society to the police or to the intelligence apparatus in a safe way. And I'd say probably 20% of our work is involved trying to help business leaders and lawyers do that.
Third and final break. We'll be right back. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So somebody who's watching says, okay, you've just scratched the surface with this conversation. Where do I find out more so that I can do exactly as you're saying? Build a better body of knowledge, share with other people, take action if possible.
Well, I would say sadly, current affairs, it's pretty hard to escape it if you look at the headlines. Like last night before I went to bed, I just scrolled down on the news feeds. And when you really look at it and you start looking for it, you'll find it everywhere. When you see money laundering, where you see transnational organized crime, when you see corruption, where you see electoral interference, cyber, all this stuff, it's all interconnected and usually driven quite often by a state, which is hybrid warfare. So it's out there in social media, but some of the good areas is we're trying to start publishing stuff for our project. So there's a little bit there, and we're trying to build more.
Who we are.
Project CSHAT.
Okay.
Yes.
And where can they find that information?
Just online through, Googling Project CSHAT.
SESHAT.
Yes.
Okay.
I think another great resource is the Finland Center on Hybrid Warfare out of Finland. It's kind of like the body of knowledge of excellency, I think. And a lot of the other things, I think the Macdonald Laurier Institute is doing some good work, and we're having some liaison with them as well. And they have some people looking at this issue as well. It's out there pretty much everywhere, sadly, right now.
Well, it becomes incumbent upon us as individuals to do our due diligence and to stay ever alert to potential threats, because we cannot naively believe that they don't exist.
Yeah, and I think, when I reflect on all this, I think the difference in terms of being successful mitigating it and not mitigating it, just thinking about the next generation is probably the most critical point.
Thank you, Calvin.